Hi everyone, and welcome to the first in our series of Straight Talking Science, a podcast series we're running to distill some of the fantastic science that's happening around Cork and Ireland in general. And we are trying to bring science to everybody on the street, that it's understandable and that you can use the information every day to better your health, better your diet in whatever respect possible. So we are honoured and thrilled to have Professor Paul Cotter with us here for the first of our series, and Paul will introduce himself in 1 second. My name is Barry Skillington. I am the Chief Commercial Officer with Atlantia Clinical Trials, and so let's get going. So Paul, maybe a quick intro from you and then we'll get into it.
Super. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's unusual to see you in this studio rather than at an airport somewhere and heading to a conference or something else. So my background, I'm a microbiologist. I'm the head of Food Biosciences at Teagasc. I'm physically located, or my office is located at Teagasc Food Research Centre in Moore Park. And in addition, I'm involved in a company called SeqBiome that spun out about 5 or 6 years ago. I'm a co-founder and I'm the head of microbiology there.
Okay, and what does SeqBiome do?
SeqBiome, I guess, provide a service for universities and academics, but also for food and pharma companies to study microbiomes. Okay. And we can get into what a microbiome is, but in simple terms, these are microbial populations that are receiving ever more attention, especially the microbiome in the gut and how that's contributing to health. But there are microbiomes in the oral cavity, on skin, in the guts of animals, in soil, in foods, and all of those can have a very profound impact on our health, their health, and indeed planetary health.
Right. Very good. And actually, that's a really good segue, right? So people on the street, everywhere, they hear all this terminology about microbiomes and, this is good for your microbiome and this probiotic is good for your microbiome. And we hear about the skin microbiome and I guess the gut microbiome predominantly, yeah? And sometimes it's hard to distill that science down into just what does that actually mean? Yeah. Do I need to eat this vegetable or do I need to take this probiotic? So maybe just from a bird's eye view, microbiomes, okay, you gave us a top line there, like what is a microbiome, right? But in terms of, it's made up of bacteria, starting there kind of thinking of your mother. I don't know if your mother's scientific or if somebody non-scientific, would they understand? You know what I mean? Yeah. So let's start there and then we can head towards fermented foods, and which is what the topic of this particular conversation is.
Sure. So the microbiome is essentially a community of microorganisms, and the community of those microbes will differ depending on the context or the particular environmental niche that you find them in. And so the microorganisms can come in different flavors. There are bacteria, but also we're all very much more aware of what viruses are and what they can do to us since COVID. Yeah. So there can be good and bad viruses in the microbiome. Those include phage, so are bacteriophage. So those are viruses that actually attack bacteria, so not just us or animals. Okay. And then you've other kind of types of microorganisms that fall under the fungi category. So that would include yeast and mold. And then there are other microorganisms that I guess people in the general public would not be very familiar with at all, like archaea and other small eukaryotes and protists and things like that. If we get there, then we'd be really digging very deeply.
All right, so so let's think of it. There's the scene. It's like a battlefield, and we got all these different players on the field now. They're all competing.
Exactly.
And so we have the microbiomes and food. So for everybody out there, you are covered in bacteria. They're in you, on you, and you cannot survive without them. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
Right. So from a bacteria perspective, I guess viromes, bacteriophages, probably not going to come into your everyday speak. You're not going to be chatting to your neighbor about your bacteriophage today. So let's talk about bacteria. Let's keep it there. Okay. There's different things. We know probiotics, we know prebiotics, and we hear about all of these. And we'll get into those maybe in later sequences or later conversations in the series, right? But you're an expert, a leading expert in fermented foods. So everybody who's listening to this podcast, you can take this as gospel. This man knows what he's talking about. Okay, so let's talk about fermented foods. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, fermented foods was the remit of, I want to say hippies boiling things in cans in fields. Like, we were there, right? We've evolved, the field has evolved, and fermented foods have come, I wouldn't say central mainstream, but certainly mainstream retail. I go into a supermarket now and I do buy kimchi and I buy sauerkraut and I buy things and they're right there and you can buy them and it's easy. It wasn't easy before and now it's easy. So maybe you could take it from there in terms of what are the different types of fermented foods that are available that we potentially should look to eat and why?
Okay. So maybe before getting into that, I'll also note though that what you described is very much a description of what indeed has happened in, I guess, Western culture.
Right.
But other parts of the world, they always consumed fermented food and never went away from them.
Fair point, yeah.
And I guess we also did maybe up to about 100 years ago, but then there was a focus on putting things in cans and sterilizing them and pasteurizing things. And while that's good for certain things, it did also mean that there was a move away from fermented foods and we just ultimately have less microbes in our diet and less good microbes in our diet as a consequence of that shift.
Oh, that's a good point, actually, yeah.
So we're kind of rediscovering them rather than,
So we started processing food and we moved away from real foods to a large degree. Now we're talking about ultra-processed foods on the outer end of that, which are rubbish foods that are super processed, that have no nutritional value hardly, as opposed to natural food at the other end of the spectrum, which is the whole vegetable, the whole fruit, and including some of the dirt on it. Like when we were kids, like we were just given fruit and you just ate it, vegetables had the skin on and
they weren't layered with pesticides.
No, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so like common types of fermented foods.
Yeah, so I guess they're the ones that people are very familiar with and probably don't realize that they're fermented. So things like cheeses and yogurts and bread, beer and wine and all of those. And then there are ones, I guess, that are probably people are encountering maybe for the first time in recent years. So are maybe people during the course of COVID pandemic started to make their own sourdough bread and started to make milk kefir or water kefir or kombucha, sauerkraut, kimchi, to name just a few. But almost every civilization across the world has its own favorite fermented food and different villages indeed, so never mind countries. And it kind of depends on what raw material you have. If you're from Norway, you're more likely to come across fermented fish. Okay. In other parts of the world, it might be fermented meat or fermented sorghum or some other grain from Africa. It depends on where you're from, but all of them will have some sort of culture or producing fermented foods because in essence, in historic times, it was the only way of preserving those foods because we didn't have refrigeration or other approaches.
Oh yeah, that's good. That's good. So, all right. And we have kimchi. So they come from different cultures. Like we have some of the yogurts, sourdough bread and whatever. By the way, do not start consuming masses of beer because you think it's fermented food. That would be a bad idea. And, everything in moderation.
Of course.
There is this notion, I guess, because people I talk to, like fermented food is like, it's a flavor, like it's sour and it's this and there's bacteria and it's bubbling and whatever.
Yeah.
And when I started to try them, and I'm going to talk from my perspective, they're actually really tasty. They've got a real savory back note and they add a lot of flavor to a lot of foods, like kimchi with eggs and, it's really good.
Yeah.
But still, when I say it to people, their faces kind of crumple up and they go, oh my God, almighty, So have you tasted all these different from all the different cultures?
No, by no means.
Fermented fish, I'm getting it.
You would spend all day, every day, just working your way through different foods in order to try to achieve that. There are literally thousands, but I've been exposed to a fair whack of them. Yeah. I'm a fermented food enthusiast, but it doesn't mean that I like every last food as well. So it's not it's not black or white.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think what I advise people from a flavor point of view, but indeed from a health point of view as well, to kind of have a bit of a trial and error, see what works for you. What works for you might not work for somebody else. And
fair enough, yeah.
And there are some foods for which there's more science gone into it and a more specific understanding of what the health promoting benefits are. But I don't doubt that there are hundreds of other benefits that we're only starting to get a good understanding of. But ultimately, if it works for you, then I'm not going to argue with that. Okay,
and that's a good, fair point, right? So do a bit of experimentation, trial and error. Like we've all tasted sourdough bread. It's not particular taste, it's really good. But other things like kimchi, I keep saying that, sauerkraut, miso, the things I know, yogurts. But so taking that then, in terms of the health benefit, what does the man or woman on the street what can they expect? So I'm going to start eating fermented foods now. Next week, I'm going to be a superhero because I'm eating fermented foods.
Yeah. So your last comment there is one that I'm very aware of, and I guess almost go to the other extreme of warning people to not have extreme expectations. So I encourage people to consume more fermented food, but as part of a healthy diet that will benefit them for the rest of their life, but not to expect miracles. And it's not that it's going to solve all of your ailments. And it's important to say that because there would be bloggers and other enthusiasts out there that make very extreme cases for where there isn't the science underpinning it. But taking that, there is a lot of good science to underpin the health benefits associated with particular fermented foods.
Right.
The yogurt in particular, there's quite a lot of research in terms of lactose intolerance and what the microbes in a yogurt can do after you consume them and how they can help to degrade lactose in your gut for people who are sensitive to that. There are lots of other research then relating to other aspects. So we have, for example, developed a milk kefir that's good for controlling your cholesterol.
Okay.
But then again, we have another version of milk kefir that's good for addressing your anxiety or stress. Oh. And there are a multitude of other benefits as well. But the key component, one of the key points that I keep coming back to when I'm talking to people about these is that if you're making your own milk kefir in your kitchen, you don't necessarily know if you have the one for the cholesterol or for the anti-stress one.
Yeah.
And you might have the one that your neighbor needs, and they might have the one that you need. Okay. And at the moment, that's why you suggested people try different foods and see what works out for them. But where I would like to see the research to grow, and what we're actually doing, and lots of other good labs around the world are trying to do this also, is to, I guess, take the fermented foods to the next level so that you have the right food with the right microbes for the right individual. So you know exactly what the health benefits are. But there are a multitude of others. So you can address like symptoms like gut discomfort and bloating and so on and so forth. And the fermented foods quite often, I guess the process of fermentation could be described as almost a pre-digestion of your food. Yeah. So by doing that, you're releasing the nutrients more quickly. They're already starting to have been broken down before you consume them. And then when you do consume them, they get into your bloodstream more rapidly. And I mean, if you think about athletes who are taking whey protein for after exercise for muscle recovery and muscle development, if it's a fermented dairy product, you will also have that whole process where you have a digestion of those materials. And in fact, whey is a byproduct of cheese manufacture, so it is a fermented product.
Okay. So and they're all good points. There's a couple there I just want to circle back to really quickly, right? So you're saying if you're making a kefir in your kitchen, so I suppose, again, some maybe misconception, maybe not, you can make fermented foods at home, right? Because a lot of foods you can't make at home. Yeah. But I'm sure people, including myself, will be like, and I've never done it for the same reason as most people will be like, what if I do it wrong? And I create a toxic whatever and kill everybody. So what are the inherent dangers? Is there any, how much research do you need to do if you're going to start experimenting with this at home?
Not an awful lot, especially if you start, if you're not too ambitious starting out. Yeah. So if you do start with a milk kefir, there's lots of YouTube material out there that you can follow. We've done lots of public engagement things where we've gone and shown people how to make milk kefir or sauerkraut or whatnot. Ultimately, if you have good starting material, because if the substrate, if the cabbage or the milk is already gone off, then it's already too late to do much with it.
So you want good qualities. All right. So we have our cabbage.
Yeah, you have your
What do I do to the cabbage to make it sauerkraut?
Yeah, so there's a mixture of different things. So you can have cabbage, you can have other vegetables in there as well, carrots and so on and so forth. And ultimately, it's a combination of some liquid and salt, so essentially brine, salty water, and storing it in a manner that is anaerobic initially to allow in the absence of oxygen. So you have to have the right containers for it. Right. And then that begins the fermentation process. And there's other tweaks and so on that I encourage people to look at that properly rather than me trying to summarize it here. But ultimately, over a period of time, the salt water selects for microbes that are on the surface of the cabbage leaves. Okay. Those microbes will begin to grow. The undesirable microbes don't grow so well. the desirable microbes not only can cope with the salt, but they produce acid. Now, not a bad acid. When people think of acid, it's something that's very extreme. But this is a mild form of acid, like called lactic acid. Other fermented foods will have acetic acid, and they will not be harmful to us, but they will kill the undesirable microbes like the listerias and the salmonellas, the ones that can make you sick.
Yeah.
And that drop in the pH, or that acidification of the food, is what gives it its extensive shelf life. After those microbes grow initially, other microbes that are there that like this new environment will begin to flourish instead. They're kind of the second generation of microbes in the food, and they're typically the ones that contribute more to the flavor then and other attributes.
Okay, good. Well, that's good to know. All right, so you don't need any magic micro sauce. You just, Now, look it up yourselves, but okay, airtight containers, a good starting material, some salt, some water. You need to look up the combination. And okay, that's good to know.
I will add, though, that so that's kind of where you're relying on what's naturally present on the surface of the cabbage or whatnot. There are other ways then where you kind of give your fermentation process kind of a kickstart.
Okay.
So that can involve a process called backslopping. It doesn't sound too nice, but it's pretty simple, whereby if you have a successful fermentation, or your body has a fermentation that worked well, you can take a little bit of the material from that fermented food and add it to the next one to kind of kickstart. Or else you can kickstart by buying, depending on the food, something like a milk kefir grain, or a water kefir grain, or a kombucha SeqBiome. And I'll explain what those are, but essentially the grains, the terminology sometimes confuses people. When you think of grain, people think of wheat and barley and whatnot. Yes. But this is actually kind of a cluster of bacteria and yeast that are bound together in kind of a matrix. And you add those to, in the case of milk, you add it to your milk to bring about the fermentation process. When you add the grain, the bacteria and yeast that are on the surface, they enter into the milk and begin the fermentation process. And I've described it in the past as almost kind of like your little Tamagotchi, for people who are old enough like me to remember Tamagotchis, where you kind of have to keep it alive and look after it and mind it.
Okay.
And if you do that, it grows in size. And it eventually gets to the point where it grows so large that it kind of splits in two. And you can take some of that and then share it with your friends and families, and they can start the process.
All around.
Exactly.
Lovely.
Yes. But they kickstart the fermentation process then.
Lovely, yeah. And I had heard of that, actually. And okay, so I'm just thinking here, are we losing anybody? I don't think we are. So it's quite simple so far, right? I'm just going to do a fast recap. We're all humans, hopefully. We're all full of bacteria, right? We all have different bacteria in different measures, and how those bacteria grow and express through your lifetime has a real impact on your health. So what we're talking about here is fermented foods, and we're adding some of the potentially better bacteria into your system that can infer a health benefit. The reason we say can and if and whatever is because it's not a guarantee and everybody's different, and so you can only talk in very generalistic terms. You're saying experiment with what works for you within your lifestyle, what works in terms of your entire lifestyle and your preference in foods, yeah? But then we talked about potentially, types of different fermented foods and how you can, make your own at home. You can equally buy them in the shop. They're just as good, I'm imagining.
Kind of depends on the brand and how they're made and whatnot. Yeah, so it's challenging for the general public. And so I would look for the right types of microbes to be there, or to be made in something that in some way represents the artisanal product. But you do have versions of the milk kefir that I described just now that don't have any kefir microbes in there. They're sold as kefir, but they contain yogurt strains instead. And so it's not really a true kefir. Right. But so in that regard, I guess I would typically look for ones where there are live microbes in the product. Okay. That's not to say some fermented foods can't be health promoting without the live microbes, but if you can have the live microbes as well, all the better.
Would it say that on there?
It would normally typically say live cultures or something something like that. Yeah, unless you're getting your foods from a farmer's market, in which case most of them will be live anyway because they've been made using the artisanal approaches.
Yes. Okay. And like Cork, we're lucky, there's a real lineage of artisanal food here, and it's a real centre of food excellence in Cork. Cork, in case this goes globally viral, is in Southern Ireland. It's the second biggest city, but the county of Cork has a fantastic dairy culture, bread, vegetables. So there's a lot of real artisanal food here, and it's an amazing place for food, actually. So up Cork. Okay, so where are we now? Let's go back. The second thing I want to circle back from earlier was the science and the research, right? So there's quite a lot of research going on. Your facility does a huge amount of research. We have APC in University College Cork, and as you said, there's labs all over the world looking at microbes, microculture, and all the earlier stuff we talked about, like bacteria, phage, and viruses and whatnot. But let's focus on bacteria. So we've come from, that kind of hippie-ish culture. I don't want to be, I'm not insulting anybody, but we've come from kind of fringe to more mainstream currently. And as you rightly point out, that's just Western culture. It's always been in the East and other cultures across the world. Where do you see the future of fermented foods? Like, people I feel, are much more aware of bacteria, but they're not very aware. They're still very confused. There's a lot of confusion out there.
Yeah.
So in terms of where's the future going?
So the future from a scientific point of view, and maybe before going down that route, I will say that there will continue to be a lot of focus on the artisanal production and I guess that whole aspect of fermented foods. And some people like to not necessarily know what microbes are in their food, and it's more about the process and producing them as families and so on. And that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We're trying to leverage those activities and other activities to underpin the health benefits that are associated with fermented food, so that we can say specifically, if somebody needs a fermented food to reduce their cholesterol or to make them less likely to have type 2 diabetes or something else, that we can cater for them through science.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that, so there are thousands of different fermented foods with very many more thousands of microbes in there. The very first probiotic concept from over 100 years ago, that concept related back to an observation around Bulgaria, where it was noted that people that consumed a fermented milk seemed to be healthier and have a longer lifespan.
Right.
And over the years, the probiotic industry has continued to develop, but it's focused more on microbes that we've gotten from our guts rather than from fermented foods. So the fermented foods as a source of health-promoting microbes it's kind of tipped away in the background, but not really been harnessed by science, and in particular, from a commercial point of view, from an industry point of view, to really advance people's health. So our idea is, and again, we're not the only ones, but we'd like to think we're among the leading labs in this regard, is to kind of disentangle the microbes that are present in a food and then put them back together in a manner whereby we're optimizing particular attributes.
Okay.
And that could be as simple as just making it taste nicer, and that's good in its own right. But also, I guess where the real opportunity, I think, is to combine them in a way where those microbes we know that they're likely to do something in the gut. That will be health promoting. Okay. That might be to help to modulate our gut microbiome and make it healthier, or to break down the foods before we consume them, or to produce a particular metabolite.
Yeah.
So the more we know about the microbes and doing an intensive analysis of their genomes and the DNA sequences, and without getting too much into the technicalities there, we can predict what microbes might be good for different things. Okay. And then start to put them back together in new, what we would call defined communities, so that when we next make a kefir, or next make a water kefir, or next make a sauerkraut, that these microbes will grow, and the health promoting microbes will grow, and those microbes will produce a metabolite or some other chemical that is good for our health as well. So it's a much more defined and controlled approach to developing these foods.
Okay, that's good. And that's kind of where probiotics, as you say, started very broad, and now more and more is becoming customized, and they're honing in on particular strains for particular indications, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and that would be really good. And so to differentiate between the two on a very broad scale, probiotics are from the bacteria within us, the commensals. Generally,
yes.
And fermented foods rely on bacteria that live outside the body, on vegetables, fruits, elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay. So you might get fermented food with a probiotic in it, but quite often that probiotic will have been sourced from the gut and added to the fermented food, added to the yogurt as an extra component, rather than being part of the fermentation process, so to speak. Okay, good. All right. So now in the journey, we're back in the supermarket in
2050. And I'm buying fermented food. Let's assume I'm still buying the standards that are out there, but now they're much more customized. So I have high cholesterol. So we know that in the dairy wall, in the dairy counter, in the supermarket, you can buy certain drinks for low in cholesterol.
Yeah.
It's plant stanols, they're called. Like, I'm sure you're all aware. And so are we kind of headed that way now? Here's a fermented food. If you have high cholesterol, this is the fermented food for you. If you have eczema, this is the fermented food for you. So because it has an effect on.
Yes, I would like to think so. I think the first step will be to bring foods to the market that will prevent or make it less likely that somebody will get ill,
Yeah.
and don't already have a disease or an illness. Because the challenge is that once you can almost be too good at developing a food, because once you start treating an illness, all of a sudden it can only be sold in a pharmacy rather than the supermarket. So
food,
so the first step will be, I think, having established the science well enough and getting the relevant approvals, is to bring these foods to markets. And again, as you say, have a personalized approach whereby you have particular foods for particular individuals. And there's already some parts of the world, in particular in Japan, where there's very many more, I would call them functional foods in the supermarkets, where they're designed for specific needs and requirements. But it's a bit more challenging in Europe because the legislation or the requirements that we need to jump or to prove that a food is health promoting are more extreme. So there's that extra burden of proof that we have here.
Okay, and I suppose that maybe brings us towards the end in terms of, so for people to understand the food industry that we work in. So we operate in the functional food industry, and we do clinical research for companies all over the world, testing these functional foods on different things: cholesterol, mood, cognition, whatever. And we collaborate with you sometimes on that research, and depending on what it is. In terms of regulation, so EFSA in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority, oversee everything we consume here from a food perspective. Okay, and in the US you have FDA, and in Japan you have FOSHU, and you have different regulatory bodies around the world. Yeah. And so to keep people safe, the regulations are quite stringent. Yeah, I mean, when you buy something on a shelf, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, above them is EFSA. There's a lot of watchdogs watching what's there. Yeah. So when I'm making it in my kitchen and I'm selling it at a farmer's market, am I still under the regulatory guide? Am I still buying food that is regulated, in other words?
There are requirements in terms of the safety of the food, and best practices and whatnots, and there's various different. In fact, at Teagasc we do lots of training for new producers to help to make them aware of what the requirements are, and to make sure that their foods are safe. But it is something we're quite if people are making it for their own purposes at home, they are responsible for the processes themselves as well, and need to have that extra care. And even things that we haven't brought up, like there's the fear of consuming a food that has spoiled somewhat, but also some fermented foods, there's a lot of gas production. So if you're not storing them in the right vessel, there can be glass can shatter and so on. So there are those other different considerations as well. But typically for the larger companies who are engaged in kind of trying to bring a new food to market, there's much more considerable undertaking and lots of human studies, for example, the sort of ones that Atlantia lead, where your participants would be consuming those foods, and to establish what are the full health benefits that they're benefiting from.
Yeah. That's a good point. And like, we do a lot to ensure the safety of our participants in every study, but manufacturers do as well. Nobody wants to cause any harm. So and I suppose when you're bulk producing, that you have to have consistency every time, and this is a fermentation, and just like brewing or whatever, it can go awry.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I didn't get into, but when I talked about earlier about making these defined communities for health benefits or for flavor, the other reason for making a defined community is just to have a consistent product on a daily basis, so that what you buy or what you make and consume today is the same as what you buy and consume in 12 months' time. Whereas the challenge for the kind of farmers market producers is that there will be variation, and your little milk kefir grain will change subtly over time, and so the flavors will change, and the flavor might be not quite as nice. Or we're at the moment we're working with a view to trying to start up a company out of Teagasc where we can provide those strains, and where we're getting most interest from companies are the ones that were small and have nearly become too successful, where they were making their fermented food on a relatively small scale, now a large supermarket chain wants hundreds or thousands of cans or bottles of that product.
Yeah.
But as they try to produce more and more, it's very hard to make it consistent enough, and things
Right.
start to go awry.
Yeah.
And that's where having a defined community of microbes that make something similar on a daily basis, and if they can be health promoting, even better, but that's required when you start to get
Right.
bigger.
And that's super important because, I mean, I come from a food background on mass production of food. And if you think about that, people out there, you know, getting it from an artisanal manufacturer at a farmer's market, and it's lovely and it looks like this and it's got a lovely color. Now get that into 100,000 supermarkets across the world, and it has to be the same lovely to everybody. That's a big feat. And so standardization of strains could be the answer. So that's really important.
Yeah, I think so. And the other issue too is that, I guess, when people are making the foods locally, and we would generally encourage people to consume the fermented foods locally and local producers and whatnot. But that's all well and good for us, where we have access to good foods locally.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't be so selfish as to think that nobody else in the world should be benefiting from our foods. And if we have a health promoting food that is only made in Cork, then that's not very fair to somebody in Buenos Aires or Cape Town or whatnot, who should also be able to benefit from the cholesterol lowering capability.
Yes, yeah.
So, but in order for that to happen, and for those foods to be able to translate or to transfer across the globe, you need to have that understanding of the microbial composition and make a standardized food so that it's consistently made.
Yeah, right. And, you know, from a microbial point of view, and I think we're going to probably finish out on this, like microbes, microbiota, the terminology we read about and we hear in newspapers and we read in magazines and whatever, and podcasts like this. The more diverse your microbes, so the more diverse the number of bacteria you have in you, on you, roll around in the mud, eat a bit of chewing gum from the ground, whatever it is best, right? I mean, more is better. More different types is better.
In general, for most part of the bodies, yes. Now, as science is progressing, there's more granular understanding as to specific microbes you want and specific microbes doing certain things. But in general, in very simple terms, yes, kind of an Amazon rainforest in your gut is better than the Sahara Desert.
Right.
And there are certain diseases where the Sahara Desert is the reason why you get like C. diff-associated diarrhea and other things.
Yeah.
So it's trying to prevent that or to address it if it happens.
And as we age, does our diversity start to fall?
Yeah, it falls. And in addition to that, certain desirable microorganisms, like people might have heard about bifidobacteria, because they're in some probiotic products. So those in particular can fall off a cliff, but there are others as well. And it's either by taking a supplement or a probiotic, or ideally not just that, but that coupled with a better diet is how you address that.
To recolonize those bacteria that we're losing. And it is possible to recolonize them?
Yeah, or to protect them so that they never leave in the first place.
Okay. And so that's kind of then plays into the longevity bit and kind of quality of life. So the healthier you can remain, obviously, for as long as possible, your microbiome has a huge part to play in that longevity.
Most definitely. There's a phenomenon called inflammaging.
Yeah.
So as people get older, they naturally are more likely to have what we call an inflammatory tone, or certain biomarkers that are associated with inflammation. And we all know inflammation, just the terminology makes us think it's not good.
Yeah.
But we know that certain diets, like things like Mediterranean diet, fiber, fermented foods, and lots of other things can help to address that, so that it's not just having people live longer, but it's so that if they are living longer, that they have a healthy lifestyle and can get out and about and be active, rather than be in a nursing home with very limited mobility.
Exactly, yeah. Like the blue zone, I'm sure we've heard of those. There's kind of a series on the blue zones around the world, and if you look at their diets, it's very much incorporates a lot of those healthy, natural, whole foods with exercise and, decent lifestyle.
The whole lifestyle piece.
Okay, so I think we've come pretty much through on a top level, like, you know, there's things to be learned here. There's definitely things to be looked up. Look up your own information. There's a lot of resources out there. You know, the more diverse your microbiome, you know, lick your neighbor's arm the next time you meet them. Let's move the microbiome around, and everybody's getting more diverse. Do you have any particular resources that good places they could go on the internet or wherever to?
Yeah, so there's lots of material on the APC Microbiome Ireland website. So that's the institute that you referred to previously. That involves University College Cork, Teagasc, and a number of others. So there's lots of material there that's available. ISAP, the International Scientific Association for Prebiotics and Probiotics, have a lot of material on their site as
on
well.
their website, yeah.
So they'd be a good place to start, but there's a number of others as well.
Okay, and I'm sure, like, as everything else, there's a multitude. But just to put a red flag, the credibility of the source is very important in all science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in recent times, like there's a lot of pseudoscience out there now.
Right.
A lot of, I guess, people who are even pushing back against science, and the whole anti-vax movement and so on is something that's very frustrating for me as a scientist. So I think ultimately you can't trump. Excuse the slip of the tongue. You can't beat good science and having the right information and the right knowledge to underpin the background. So yes, I'm glad you raised that point. The source of the information really is key, because you'll find lots of information out there that is just meaningless and could not only not improve your health, but could actually disimprove your health.
Okay, good to know. All right, Paul, thanks a million. Everybody that's out there, you can look up this man. He's got a bio. He works with Teagasc, as we've said, with the APC. He's got a multitude of research and published papers out there. So, follow along if you so are interested or inclined. And I hope to talk to you all again soon in the next episode of this series, and we'll talk about something completely different. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thanks, Barry.